Before getting into the bulk of what this video is actually about, which I promise is related to the title, I think it's important to first clarify my general thoughts on how this Fionna and Cake are related to this Fionna and Cake and this Fionna and Cake. As much as I loved the newest batch of episodes from this franchise, they were intentionally somewhat vague in what this connection actually is, likely in an attempt to not muddy things more than they need to be muddied, so every single person watching this video probably has a slightly different view on it. From what I can tell, and please comment below if you think I'm completely bungling this, but it's the show's take that Prismo placed the Fionna and Cake universe in Simon's mind, and then Simon wrote stories that at least somewhat reflected the reality of that universe. This explanation is obviously less than specific, but let's just roll with it for a second. As you probably know, there are 5 different Fionna and Cake episodes in the main series, all with varying frame stories. The first and 4th episodes feature Ice King telling a story about the pair, the 2nd and 3rd feature Marceline and LSP telling stories to Simon about the pair, and the 5th features tapes that mysteriously contain footage of the pair. Now, out of these 5 episodes, which ones would you say contain canon appearances of miniseries Fionna and Cake? The Adventure Time wiki, which I really do love, would tell you that all of them do. But we all know that's wrong, right? Fionna and Cake 5 probably does, and I think the show at least wants you to believe that 1 and 4 do, at least partly anyway. I wouldn't think that anybody thinks this is canon. But pretty objectively, these 2 episodes, Bad Little Boy and The Prince Who Wanted Everything, have stories told by characters with no connection to the Fionna and Cake universe, and thus are presumably just making things up. But despite this, it feels like discussion online entirely ignores everything I just said, even though anybody who thought about this for more than 3 seconds would clearly see that you can't possibly think that this Fionna and Cake are the same characters as Fionna and Cake's Fionna and Cake or Fionna and Cake's Fionna and Cake, and this is a video about Bad Little Boy. For reasons that don't make for a great video, this is one of my favorite episodes of one of my favorite shows, with some really catchy songs, some really memorable performances, and just a generally fun atmosphere that the show never really replicates. Even though there are like 9 or so episodes that I like more than this one, this is probably the one that I've watched the most times, as just a nice quarter hour to turn on that turns off my brain. However, while watching it over and over and over again, I eventually began to look at Bad Little Boy in a slightly different way. While the episode kind of just breezes past it, the inner story of this one is entirely conjured by a single character, Marceline, and therefore, just like any story, contains fragments of its creator's view on the world around them. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. As should be obvious, each character in the story has a gender-bent equivalent in OO that Marcy personally knows, and therefore it's quite reasonable, at least to the person who spent way too long on this hopefully under 10-minute video, to look at her portrayal of these characters for clues to how she views the people they're based on. And while there are dozens of gender-bent characters in this one, and I'm sure you'd love to hear me explain this scene, I really just want to focus on 3 different portrayals, starting with the ruler of the Candy Kingdom himself, Prince Gumball.
Oh my, looks like you almost scronked up my dome piece.
Despite having very little screen time in this episode, as he never even leaves the treehouse, there's actually a fair bit to talk about when it comes to how Marcy decided to include Prince Gumball in her story. For starters, by far the biggest deviation regarding the prince's portrayal in comparison to his gender-bent counterpart is actually how Fionna views him, seeing the missions that he sends her on, and subsequently him as a person, as boring. Really, everything about this character's depiction in this episode basically comes down to him being the epitome of all the parts of PB that could possibly be described as lame. Something that makes quite a bit of sense when you consider where Marcy and Bonnie's relationship is at this point. While the audience is certainly led to believe that these two interact between episodes, episodes. The last time we saw them together, which was somehow 2 entire seasons before this, they weren't exactly on good terms, a dispute that Marshall's greeting seems to reflect.
Sorry I don't treat you like you're perfect, like all your little loyal subjects do.
Oh, forgive me. Hello, Your Majesty.
Throughout their short interaction, Gumball is just entirely rude and dismissive towards Marshall before the latter even does anything. Something that just isn't really congruent with the reality of how PB actually acts towards Marcy, but also something that makes sense would occur in a Marceline told story. During the 60 or so seconds of screen time that the character actually gets here, Gumball perfectly fits all of the parts of PB that we've seen Marcy complaining about during their times apart, as he's too focused on his lame candy missions to even acknowledge the vampire royalty in front of him, perhaps making the best argument that this story is indeed being impacted by the one telling it. But even despite all of this, I think you can make the argument that it's actually Gumball's lack of involvement in this tale that tells the bigger story here, as if Marcy feels like the two of them are as far apart as they've ever been. In the dozen or so episodes that follow this one, we'll get outings like Sky Witch or even Time Sandwich, which show these two on much better terms. But I think this episode shows Marcy's fear of what might happen if she were to just show up and try to be a part of PB's life again. Just like Marshall Lee, she might be rejected.
Hang out with me.
Before getting to Fiona's depiction, it's time for me to once again bring up one of the least fun discussions you can possibly have about these characters. Is Fionna actually the same age as Finn? When discussing these episodes in a pre-miniseries world, I was 100% sure that this wasn't the case, and that Fionna had clearly been aged up to tell the romantic stories that the crew clearly wanted to tell with these characters. It just doesn't make any sense that the Fionna of these first 2 episodes is only 13 or 14, both in the sense that Gumball sees her as an appropriate partner, and just how this character is portrayed. But then came the reveal, more than a decade after even this episode, that Fionna is a real character that lives relative to our Finn, and thus it became pretty hard to argue that they're not the same age. Except, as I mentioned before, the character in this episode is not this Fionna. It's a Fionna based on this Fionna, and therefore there's no reason to assume that Marcy didn't just age her up and not mention it. Now, as you may be asking, even if you were to believe that, isn't it kind of weird for Marcy to write a romantic fanfic about versions of herself and a 14-year-old Finn? And to that I say, yeah, you might have a point there. The obvious rebuttal here is that Marcy is just trying to tell a story that her audience would enjoy, and the princesses did request romance, but I understand that for most viewers, that's not exactly enough to make this not at least a little bit weird. Anyway, moving past that weirdness before it ruins the concept of this video, besides the aforementioned boredom with being Gumball's knight that I mentioned before, the biggest aspects of Fiona's portrayal here really comes down to both the character's ability to bring out the good in Marshall, as well as being, in his eyes, the quote, realist person. To start with the former, most of this plays out in the ridiculously fun and catchy Good Little Girl, a song that highlights both characters' desire to dip their toes into the other's worlds, as Fionna wants to have a bit of rebellious fun, and Marshall desires to partake in a bit of wholesome activities, even as both characters reject that idea. In general, this dynamic, although obviously not romantic, is a reflection of the gender-bent versions of these characters. While the show has somewhat retroactively pretended that Marcy has always been chill, the first few appearances from the character were especially unhinged, to the point of actually being villainous until she started hanging out with Finn. This relationship between these two characters is kind of thrown away for Bubbling about halfway through the show, but I think it's reflected pretty well here, especially in how the ending implies that Marcy views Finn. After Marshall fakes a fatal injury, an action that I promise we'll get to in a second, he tries to goad Fionna into admitting that she's into him, only for her to reply with the dialogue that's currently on screen. Throughout this entire episode, there's a level of genuineness from the character that peaks here, and it's a genuineness that Marcy seems to also respect in Finn. A constant in the relationship between Bubblegum and Marceline is that these two characters just can't be honest with each other, as it's the reason they spend the bulk of the series apart when they want to both be together. So it makes sense that Marcy would see Finn's honesty as something to admire and thus incorporate that into her story. In general, I think Fiona's character in this tale, being the protagonist and all, is pretty reflective of Marcy's general stance towards Finn, seeing him as a genuinely good guy who helps her become a better person. Something that's true both within and outside of this episode.
Don't you know I'm a villain? Every night I'm out killing, sending everyone running like children.
The most immediate comparison between Marshall Lee and his gender-bent counterpart / kind of creator is that Marcy made the coolest version of herself possible. Marshall is confident, smooth, he spits catchy Cartoon Network bars, and is simply similar to Marcy in every way that Marcy likes about herself, while also containing two more insecurities that I find way more interesting to talk about. The first one is something that launches the second half of the plot, as Marshall kidnaps Cake for nothing more than a vice he shares with the vampire queen, jealousy, and I think it's really interesting how they use it here. If you're confused and trying to figure out who Marcy is jealous of throughout the main show, it's not a who that I'm referring to, it's a what. And it's something we've already touched on in this video. Throughout the description of the relationship before we meet them, one of the biggest reasons that PB and Marcy didn't work out is because of the former's devotion to her Candy Kingdom, and it's that jealousy that I believe is being reflected in this catnapping. In neither case is the character jealous of romantic attraction, but instead just simply desiring attention. Really, throughout this entire episode, that's all that Marshall is ever after. Dramatically making his presence known at the treehouse, taking over the party by taking the stage, and ultimately faking his own death, all so that Fionna will focus on him. Just as Marcy slowly lost PB to her work, Marshall is desperately fighting against the feeling of being left alone, even if he hurts those around him in the process. And that actually brings us to the second thing I want to mention, which is seemingly Marcy confronting a character trait that defined many of her first appearances in the show. Throughout Marceline's first couple of appearances, the character is nothing short of unhinged, constantly doing things for her own amusement that simply go too far and hurt others. Something that pretty aptly describes the acts of Marshall Lee in this one. When the character fakes his own death, we get a pretty brutal reaction from Fionna that almost seems out of place in an episode that's as low-key as this one, as she genuinely believes that, in an event that was somewhat her fault, that her friend has sustained a fatal injury. A reaction that almost immediately forces Marshall to confess. In general, the biggest takeaway from these two character traits of Marcy manifesting themselves in her own self-insert is that, in her own story, Marshall is the villain. Sure, there might not be any real stakes, well, besides that one, but it's still pretty hard to see this episode in a way that doesn't paint Marshall in a pretty bad light, as he cracks jokes at others' expense, seems constantly insecure and jealous, and acts so recklessly that he causes his own friend to sob. All things that point to a certain level of self-loathing within Marceline. This is a character that doesn't just believe that there's something wrong with her in a demon or rock and roll type of way, but that she has character flaws that can, and have, damaged the relationships she has with those she cares about most. At least that's an interpretation that you could have. If you made it this far into this video and still don't really believe its premise, then you may still be right. Even after spending hours trying to make this theory work in my head, I'm still about 50-50 on whether or not the crew behind this episode put any thought into who's actually telling the story, and about 100% sure that at least something that I said in this video is made up. As I mentioned before, even the Adventure Time wiki, which is a site that I am on somehow even more than you would expect, doesn't seem to mention the discrepancy between this Fionna and Cake and this Fionna and Cake. Something that, unless you believe Marcy is somehow tapping into the mind of Simon to retrieve this story, just doesn't really make any sense. But that's not really the argument. I'm not trying to convince you that logically this story had to be made from the biases of Marcy. The point of this video is that this theory is supported by the episode, which I hope I at least supplied some interesting points if that is the case. In general, Bad Little Boy came at a point in between season 4 and Stakes where the show wasn't really doing anything with Marcy, and I think that by looking at this episode as if it was the manifestation of her opinions on the citizens of Ooo, it gives us a rare look into the Vampire Queen's psyche during a time where we desperately needed it. Seeing how she viewed PB as this pompous ruler who hated her, viewed Finn as this altruistic and honest guy worth respect, and viewed herself as somebody who could be reckless and envious to the point of hurting those she cared about most, it's just some really interesting storytelling within storytelling that provides another side to an episode that I already loved so much. Or maybe not. Anyway, that's about it for me. Thank you so much to everybody who checked out this video and stuck with it all the way to the end. I know this wasn't quite like the stuff I usually make, but after probably putting out my most analytical video yet, I really needed a somewhat lighter project. Even if I ended up watching this episode way too many times, taking notes, and annotating the transcript. For everybody who does like my more serious takes on the show though, I promise the long-awaited Islands video is still coming, but at this point it's probably going to be over an hour, so I need a little bit more time. Also, one final thing. A couple of weeks ago, I put out a survey for the people who watch my stuff, so if you'd like a say in what direction this channel goes, it'd mean a lot if you took a few minutes to fill it out. Either way though, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks with a very different video. Thanks for watching.